Part 10, The Falling Away. One is always wrong to open a conversation with the devil, for however he goes about it, he always insists on having the last word. André Gide. It is hoped that possible readers of this book, who may not be acquainted with the Catholic story, will by now have grasped one essential fact, that the general decline of the Church was brought about by the council that goes by the name of Vatican II. Furthermore, that the council was called by John XXIII, who, like several of the prelates and many of lesser title under his papal wing, were clandestine members of secret societies, and who were, according to the age-long ruling of the Church, excommunicate and therefore debarred from fulfilling any legitimate priestly function. The disastrous results of their being allowed to do so, with papal approbation, since both the popes who followed Pius XII were part of the overall conspiracy, while the recent John Paul I and John Paul II are subject to suspicion, are apparent to the most superficial observer. Such results are the outcome of Paul VI's main wish regarding the implementation of Vatican II, as expressed in his last will and testament, and repeated more than once by John Paul II, let its prescriptions be put into effect. Those prescriptions were defined years ago in the policies of Adam Weishaupt, Little Tiger, Nubius, and others, already quoted, for their trained disciples to infiltrate, and then to wear down the authority, practices, and very life of the Church. This they have accomplished, under the guise of progress or liberation. Every aspect of the Church, spiritual and material, has been taken over, from Peter's chair, with its once regal dignity, to a faldstool in the most insignificant parish church. The few priests who recognized this were kept in the background, or, if they managed to get a hearing, were exposed to ridicule, and surveying the scene, with its disorders, the exhibitions of profanity, and sexual aberrations, staged in some of its most revered buildings, including St. Peter's, one is tempted to think of a once highly disciplined guards brigade being transformed into a mob of screaming hooligans. One may pass from the truism, that little things are little things, to a more comprehensive realization that little beginnings are not little things, and it is by working precisely on that principle that the modern controllers of the Church achieved their ends without producing too much alarm among the populace at large. They began by relaxing formal disciplines and inhibitions, such as keeping Friday as a meatless day. Then certain symbols, rituals, and devotions went. The old liturgical language of Latin practically disappeared. The nun's habit, which had never failed to inspire respect even in the most irreligious, went out of use, as did the cassock. The latter was sometimes replaced by jeans, as was demonstrated by two novices who, in Rome, went up to the altar to receive the blessing of their Father General, looking more like hippies than future Jesuits. A small cross, worn in the lapel of a jacket, was fast becoming the only sign that the wearer was a priest. The old idea of priestly authority, whether exercised by a simple cleric or by the Pope, was effectively destroyed, and voices were always ready to applaud whenever the Church squandered this or that of its inheritance. The priest is today no longer a special being, cried the exultant Yves Marsaudin, a member of the Masonic Supreme Council of France. A congress of moral theologians, held at Padua, went much further. The individual conscience is the Christian's supreme authority above the papal magisterium. It was becoming generally accepted that one day the traditional church must disappear or adapt itself. It was to become one of many institutions, with the accumulated legacies of 2,000 years being cast away as things of little worth. A quick glance at available statistics, over those years, shows a startling falling off in all the relative departments of church life. Vocations, baptisms, conversions, and church marriages, took a downward plunge. The only increase was in the number of those who walked out of the church. Many preferred to read the liturgy of the Mass in their homes on Sundays and days of obligation, rather than see its once dignified movements parroted, and hear the historic language cheapened in church. In England, between the years 1968 and 1974, it has been reckoned that some 2.5 million people fell away, and, if one may add to that the selling of Catholic journals, the most popular of these, the Universe, had an average weekly circulation of nearly 312,000 in 1963. 9 years later that figure had dropped to under 180,000. In France, with 86% of the population officially Catholic, 10% put in an appearance at Mass, while a similar figure from 1971 to 1976 applied even to Rome. During the same period, in South America, once regarded as one of the toughest nuts for anti-clericals to crack, and where the people were commonly regarded as being steeped in superstition, an estimated 25,000 priests renounced their vows. Vatican sources reported that there were 3,000 resignations a year from the priesthood, and that figure took no account of those who dropped out without troubling to get ecclesiastical approval. The Catholic part of Holland, where the new teaching was paramount, was in a truly parlous condition. Not a single candidate applied for admission to the priesthood in 1970, and within 12 months every seminary there was closed. In the United States, in the 7 years prior to 1974, 1 in every 4 of the seminaries put up their shutters. The traffic was all one way, for apart from the recorded drop in church attendance, a regular procession of priests and nuns, in the spirit of the new freedom, were deciding that marriage offered a more comfortable daily round than life in the presbytery or cloister. Rebel priest, aged 50, weds girl of 25. So ran a typical headline in the Daily Express of September 9, 1973. The marriage was celebrated in a Protestant church, where the attendance was brightened by priests and nuns who were all professionally geared to add their blessings to the confetti. Many priests had passed beyond the hinting stage and were now openly declaring in favor of abortion. As for the sacrament of matrimony, as more and more couples tired of encountering the same face at breakfast, the Church discovered that it had been wrong in pronouncing them man and wife. Pleas of consanguinity, non-consummation, or that neither party had been validly baptized, were the order of the day, and the granting of annulments became quite a flourishing business. By 1972, a few years after the rot had set in, Pope Paul personally disposed of some 4,000 cases. Thus encouraged, a veritable flood of applications followed. Very few of those in search of freedom were definitely refused, but were advised to try again or to come back later. In Trenton, New Jersey, Bishop Rice was so overworked that he nominated 17 extra priests to help him. I quote his own words, beef up the number of annulments. In March 1981 the Vatican took the quite superfluous step, so it seemed to many, of reiterating its Canon Law 2335, which stated that any Catholic who joined a secret society faced excommunication. To the man in the street, who was unaware that dozens of clerics, some in the highest offices of the Church, had already broken that law, it seemed a mere formality. But the Vatican, acting on information received, knew very well what it was doing. It was protecting itself, in advance, from any likely effects of a scandal that broke in May of the same year. The government of the country, headed by Christian Democrats, was formed of a coalition that included socialists, social democrats, and Republicans. But the communists were now demanding a place in the coalition, for political ends. That left no doubt of their intentions. The problem is, they said, to remove democratic institutions, the state apparatus, and economic life from the Christian democratic power structure. But their efforts failed. The Christian Democrats held firm. So their enemies resorted to a weapon that has proved no less deadly in political warfare than assassination. They brought about a far-reaching scandal which, they hoped, would topple the existing order of government in Italy. It was made to appear, as part of the repercussions which, following the breakup of Michel Cindana's financial empire, had rumbled through the early summer of 1981, that the activities of a widespread and dangerous secret society, known as Propaganda 2, P2 for short, had come to light. But in the confused world of politics and finance, things do not happen as simply as that. The people who, when compelled to do so, cry out against the machinations most loudly, have invariably been part of the backstairs conspiracy. The fact of frauds being brought into the open may be through personal spite, disappointed blackmail, or the probing of some overzealous underling. Why couldn't he keep quiet? And the self-righteous profiteers who, from their lofty moral pedestals but with their pockets suffering, cannot do less than publicize the swindle, have to fume in private. The exposure of P2 began when the police received a mysterious call advising them to search the home of Licio Gelli, a prestigious name in secret societies, and to investigate his relationship with the erstwhile Barotrundler, Michel Cindana. The mere mention of Cindana made the implicated members of the Curia think of how to avoid being caught up in the scandal. Hence their apparently unnecessary reminder to the world at large that Canon 2335 was still valid. Meanwhile, the police had come upon a suitcase in Gelli's house containing the names of 935 members of P2. There were many prominent politicians, including 3 cabinet ministers and 3 undersecretaries, army generals and navy chiefs, leading bankers and industrialists, secret service heads, diplomats, judges, and magistrates, civil servants in foreign affairs, defense, justice, finance, and the treasury, top names in radio and television, and the managing director, editor, and publisher of Italy's leading newspaper, Corriere della Sera. Many others resigned, while a whole host of others came crashing down, like so many Humpty Dumpties, when the lists were published. More sizable litter followed as the government of Arnaldo Forlani, in its entirety, was swept off the wall. The accusers and their victims were, of course, all members of the same gang. It was a case of brothers falling out with a vengeance. The usual accusations and recriminations followed, involving every degree of crime, even murder. The falsification of accounts, espionage, and official stealing passed as minor considerations. Through it all, the Vatican reacted with only a mild fluttering of hearts. For although the Church had shed its aura of reverence, and its prestige had been reduced to a shadow, it remained inscrutable. The ghost of its former self was still potent. The fatally loaded guns might be leveled against its walls, but there was no Kenwunner to apply the match. It was a wise cynic who said, "In Italy religion is a mask." Although no churchman had been named in the scandal, the breaking of the Cindana story indirectly led to the Church reviewing its attitude to the secret Societies. This had, according to Orthodox belief, been settled by the said canon. Law 2335, which forbade any Catholic, on pain of excommunication, to join one. But in spite of that, because so many clerics, including members of the Curia, had broken that law, negotiations between the two sides, started in 1961, had been carried on for 11 years, with Cardinal Bea, the Pope's Secretary of State, whose name was as doubtful as his nationality, assisted by Cardinal Koenig of Vienna, and Monsignor J. de Toth, putting forward a more amenable version of the Church's viewpoint. These prolonged talks were more concerned with ironing out past differences than with formulating any future policy. But they managed to keep off the subject of hidden designs against the Church, which had partly prompted the latter's ban. Then came further discussions at Augsburg in May, 1969, where consideration was given to papal pronouncements that roundly condemned the societies, and there was more apprehension in conservative quarters when such equivocal terms as placing papal bulls in their historical context, and the removal of past injustices, were used to explain the purpose of the assemblies. The outcome of this newly founded relationship fully justified the doubts of those who feared that the Church was giving ground, and going back on its judgments that had been defined as final, and that the thin end of the wedge was being imposed became apparent in July of the same year, after a meeting at the monastery of Einsiedeln, Switzerland. It was there confidently anticipated, by Professor Schwartzbaver, that no reference to the seamy side of secret societies would be made. Neither was it. Instead, it was announced that Rome's previous rulings on relationship between the Church and secret societies had not been contained in papal bulls or encyclicals but in canon law, which, as every updated cleric knew, was being revised. This occasioned more serious doubt in Orthodox quarters. It was recalled that canon law refers to a body of laws, authorized by the Church, and binding to those who are subject to it by baptism. Could it mean that such terms as binding, revision, and alterations, were on the point of being subjected to new interpretations? Moreover, more than one papal bull had certainly contained a condemnation of the societies. The societies, and this must be repeated, had no intention of refuting their original intention of undermining the Church. They had no need. They had so far succeeded in their design. Their own men had infiltrated and taken over the Church at every level, and to such an extent that the Church seemed in a hurry to abandon what was left of its original claims, its historic rights, and majesty, and now the societies waited for their picked men, cardinals, and others, to present themselves before the world, cap in hand, and cry aloud their past errors of judgments. A definite move towards this came from the once highly orthodox center of Spain, where Father Ferrer Benimeli put forward the extraordinary plea that papal bulls, condemning the societies, could no longer be regarded as valid. An undertaking that strictures imposed by canon law on secret societies in the past would not again be invoked, was given by Cardinal Koenig when Church and secular representatives met at Lichtenau Castle in 1970. Then came the statement that canon law and papal bulls had been all very well in the 12th and 13th centuries, but such documents now had a mainly historical significance, and their import could not be enacted by a Church that was preaching the more significant doctrine of brotherly love, which, together with friendship and morality, provided one of the most excellent tenets of the societies. The critics of these get-together tactics saw in this a concession to the fraternal spirit inspired by the societies, and also a virtual endorsement of the cult of man that Pope Paul had preached in the United States, and in which he had been confirmed by the Masters of Wisdom. The general result of these contacts, on the church side, was submitted for examination by the Congregation for the Faith, and the outcome was decided in advance by the remarks and reservations that accompanied them. It was no use looking back at what the church had formerly decided. Comparison showed that its past attitude was old-fashioned, and properly belonged to a time when it had taught no salvation outside the church. That slogan too was outmoded, and the world's press, including most Catholic organs, again went to work with a will, as it always did when it came to propagating views that undermined tradition and reinforced the designs of those secret society members who wore mitres in the Vatican. With the Holy Office continuing to bend over backwards to confirm the changes, the process of secularization gained momentum from the autumn of 1974 onwards. It was made clear that the bar against secret societies had become a dead letter, and that its abrogation was bringing relief to a number of good people who joined them merely for business or social reasons. They no longer presented a danger to the church. The dismay occasioned by this in some quarters was summed up by Father Pedro Arapi, General of the Society of Jesus, Jesuits, who saw it as a concession to organized naturalism which, he said, had entered into the very territory of God and was influencing the minds of priests and religious. Naturalism, by dogmatically asserting that human nature and human reason alone must be supreme in all things, was another echo of the cult of man. The Church's changing attitude towards secret societies was reflected in this country Britain by John Carmel Heenan, who was appointed Archbishop of Westminster in 1963 and created Cardinal 2 years later. In keeping with his hopeful expectation that the Church's ban on the societies would soon be abolished, some of his senior clergy were authorized to negotiate with them. The Cardinal was then informed that a publication repeating the differences between the two sides was on sale in Catholic bookshops in his diocese. He expressed his concern. "If, as I suspect, it is misleading, I shall see that it is withdrawn." He did so, and that publication, together with all similar ones, disappeared. An interested inquirer who wrote to the Cardinal on the matter received, in reply, an assurance that the Cardinal conveyed his blessing. The same inquirer, on calling at the Catholic Truth Society bookshop, near Westminster Cathedral, was told that there had been no dealings with the Cardinal, and that the booklets had been withdrawn through lack of public interest. The growing belief that Canon 2335 would not appear in any revised edition of church law, together with the fact that orthodox elements were being outmaneuvered, as they had been at Vatican II, led to the Church and the societies expressing a more open relationship. There was, for instance, a dedication breakfast at the New York Hilton Hotel in March 1976, presided over by Cardinal Terence Cook, seconded by Cardinal Kroll of Philadelphia, and attended by some 3,000 members of secret societies. Cardinal Brandao Viola of San Salvador de Bahia represented Brazil. In his speech, Cardinal Cook referred to this joyous event as marking a further stage on the road to friendship. He regretted past estrangements, and hoped that his presence there signified that the new understanding between the two sides would never again be compromised. To the cardinals and the masters, it was not so much an outsize breakfast party as a momentous union, effected by opponents who had never before at any time come, openly, together. Cardinal Kroll, as president of the United States Bishops' Conference, had previously been approached by Cardinal Sepper, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who voiced the fears of those who regretted the signs of vital changes in the Church. Sepper was informed that no alteration had been made, and that none was pending within the area of central legislation. It is still, and in all cases, said Kroll, in a statement that even to read causes a raising of the eyebrows, forbidden for clerics, religious, and members of secular institutes to belong to a secret society organization. Those who enroll their names in associations of the same kind which plot against the Church, or the legitimate civil authorities, by this very fact incur excommunication, absolution, from which is reserved for the Holy See. It was true that no active plot against the Church was then in motion. The societies could well afford to sit back and to take breath, not through any decisive change of heart, but because the first stage of the plot had been successfully accomplished. Two of the societies choosing, in the persons of John XXIII and Paul VI, had occupied Peter's chair. Others of their kind, who had received a red hat or a bishop's mitre, had dominated their councils. The next move in the plot against the Church was being reserved for the future, when the innovations in doctrine and practice had been accepted by a generation who had never known what it was to respond to the guiding hands of popes such as the now belittled Pius XII. The rearguard, for so the anti-liberals may be called, made what capital it could by harking back to Canon 2335, and to the Sindenas scandal as illustrating the widespread disasters brought about by contact with a secret society. As part of this campaign, a German Episcopal Conference of Bishops was held in the middle of 1981, where it was stressed, without any qualification, that simultaneous membership of the Catholic Church and of a secret society is impossible. The full text is given in Amtsblatt des Bistums, Cologne, June 1981 issue. This was followed by the Italian government approving a bill to outlaw and dissolve all secret societies, and reminding Catholics that excommunication was still the Church's penalty for joining one. But both the German and Italian pronouncements were merely smoke screens, and none recognized this more than the societies, who were not in the least impressed. That Canon 2335, if it appeared at all in any revised edition of Church law, would be shorn of its urgency, had passed from being rumor and newspaper gossip to becoming an imminent fact. An English prelate, Cardinal Heenan, had said more than that, and had even anticipated it being abolished. While a leading official of the societies in Rome, unruffled, said he had it on good authority that canon law was being revised, as it was, in fact, by a commission of cardinals that had been set up by John XXIII and continued under Paul VI. The official went on to say that the still apparent differences between the Church and the societies were all part of the conflict in the Vatican between the traditionalists and the progressives. This may well have been, and he could well afford to shrug it off, their last attack upon us. That pronouncement, like every other emanating from the same quarter, has proved to be correct. For it has now to be accepted, according to a statement from the Holy See, that the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has ruled that Canon 2335 no longer automatically bars a Catholic from membership of Masonic groups. It had probably been by Pope Paul's own wish, in defiance of a custom that was part of a Christian's, and especially a Catholic's, second nature, that, after his death in 1978, there was no crucifix, nor even the most common religious symbol, a cross, on the catafalque when his body was placed for veneration in St. Peter's Piazza. Was it a silent acknowledgement that his work, in compliance with the secret council enjoined upon him since the time he became Archbishop of Milan, had been well and truly done? Part 11, Enigma of Paul VI. Part 11, Enigma of Paul VI. O villain! Thou hast stolen both mine office and my name. Shakespeare. To those unacquainted with the power and scope of secret societies, the personality of Pope Paul VI presents a veritable enigma. No other pope, even in the most tempestuous times, has been the subject of such conflicting reports. No other pope has been so apparently self-contradictory. Even a casual reading of his reign leaves an impression of doubt, equivocation, and a pathetically weak kind of hedging that is a far remove from the assertive pontificates of the past. For how can one account for a pope lamenting, as Paul did, that one can no longer trust the Church? He signed the documents that kept Vatican II on course, and promised, almost in the early hours of his reign, to consolidate and implement its decisions. Yet he changed his tune even before the last of its sessions. One would have believed the council would have brought sunny days for the Church's history. On the contrary, they are days of storm, cloud, and fog. How did this come about? And the answer he provided: we think there has been the influence of a hostile power. His name is the devil tempts one to ask whether that was a form of confession, a self-indictment. Was he merely expressing what he knew had become fact, or speaking as a victim, a disillusioned man in the grip of forces beyond his control? Compare his judgments with those of almost any of his predecessors, a Pius V, a Leo XIII, and the contrast appears to be, as I said before, quite pitiful. To quote but two instances. On September 14, 1972, he came down heavily against the suggestion that women might play some part in the ministry of the priesthood. Such a departure from custom was unthinkable. Yet his was not a decisive voice. For only some 3 weeks later the Vatican issued a handout to journalists, announcing that the Pope might change his mind. The final contradiction came on March 29, 1973, when the Associated Press reported, Pope Paul ruled today that women, regardless of whether they are nuns, may distribute communion in Roman Catholic churches. The Pope had already, in May 1969, condemned a new departure that had crept in whereby communion was received in the hand. Yet later he took that stricture back, with the meaningless proviso that communion bread could be so received after proper instruction. His weakness, his yielding to innovation in ritual and practice, together with the acceptance of revolutionary Marxism, and the many strange rumors that issued, from time to time, from the Vatican, caused many people in more than one part of the world to wonder if they were indeed witnessing the fall of Rome. It was said that the Pope's correspondence, before it reached him, passed through the hands of Casiroli, Villot, and Benelli, the cardinals in virtual control of the Vatican. Statesmen and churchmen who paid official visits found Pope Paul diffident, almost vague, and more ready with comments and opinions than with definite answers. He lacked clarity, and as wonder gave way to a feeling of disquiet, various theories emerged to account for the air of mystery around Peter's chair. The most feasible one, that Paul was an anti-pope, a trained communist infiltrator, could be supported by his known past, his friendship with the anarchist Alinsky and others of his kind in Milan, and the heresies he had fostered since coming to power. Other explanations will be advanced here, not because they figure among The beliefs of the present writer, who regards them as extravagant, some wildly so, but in order to make known what many intelligent people have come to think. In the face of a situation akin to those, in centuries past, when the forces of St. Michael and Asmodeus clashed by the banks of the Tiber. One theory is that Paul VI, a good pope in the normal sense, fell into the hands of agents of secret societies, and here the names of Villot, Casseroli, and Benelli crop up again, who drugged him, injected poison into his veins, and made him incapable of reasoning, so that all that purported to be stamped by the magisterium of the Church came, in reality, from the triumvirate of cardinals. But that would seem to be ruled out by Montini's lifelong attachment to Marxism, which would have obviated the need for the left-orientated secret societies to exert any pressure upon him. That would have been superfluous. Though there was one utterance by the Pope, when a dignitary asked him to quieten the widespread alarm, that might have been taken as indicative. Do you people believe the Pope to be badly informed, or subject to pressure? At length, stories emanating from Rome of sacrilege and abuses committed in church, with the approval of the Pope, became so startling, that groups of people in Europe and America decided to take action. This culminated in a Mr. Daniel Scullin of the Marion Press in Georgetown, Ontario, Canada, employing the Pinkerton Detective Agency in New York to investigate. One of the agency's detectives was sent, in 1973, to Rome, and he returned with a story that dwarfed all other speculations, however sensational. He had determined that there were two popes living in the Vatican, Paul VI, and an impostor who had been made to resemble Montini with the aid of plastic surgery. Several such operations were necessary, and when color photographs of the false pope were sent to interested circles in Munich, where the imposture is still receiving concentrated study, there were certain noticeable differences in the two sets of features that could not be overcome. To point out the differences, Montini had clear blue eyes, large, and being long-sighted he only required glasses for near viewing. The impostor had green eyes, small, and he wore glasses with thick lenses on all occasions. Montini's photographs reveal a small mole, or birthmark, between the left eye and the left ear. This does not appear in photographs of the impostor, whose left eyebrow was nearer to the eye than was Montini's. The differences between the nose and the ears of the two men are held to be decisive. Montini's nose was Roman, and protruded somewhat over his mouth. The impostor's nose, part straight and part hooked, was short, and those who subjected the photographs to professional examination claimed to have detected the insertion of a plastic strip in the nose to make it appear more straight. But it is differences in the shape and formation of the ears that present the greatest difficulty to those who doubt the existence of an impostor. Such differences are unique, individual, and they are treated the same as fingerprints. In courts of law, any comparison of the lobes and build of the ears, as revealed by photographs, becomes not a little impressive. But the interested circles did not stop there. They turned their attention upon the voice, and called in the help of the Type B65K Elemetrics of Pine Brook, New Jersey, and the Ball Telephone Company. Their object was to analyze the voice, or voices, if there were indeed two popes, when they pronounced the traditional Easter Sunday and Christmas Day blessing, with the words Indulgentium Peccatorum, spoken from the Vatican in 1975. On both occasions the message was broadcast over Rome, and many people taped it, and it appeared, according to sonograms that were made, and sonograms are more sensitive than the ear that the man who had spoken at Easter, and again at Christmas, had not been one and the same. There had been two different speakers. Here I quote from those who are qualified to judge the sonograms and sum up the distinctions. One voice had a much lower pitch than the other, with a more pronounced dragging of word syllables. Another difference was that one voice had a much lower range of frequencies. It emitted a more hissing sound and was noticeably shaky. These graphs were submitted to the FBI for examination, and the same conclusions were arrived at. The voice patterns were different, and indicated that the vocal cords, the mouth, and the lips, were unique to each individual. Subsequent statements alleging that there was a false Pope Paul VI, go on to say that he was an actor whose initials are PAR, and that it was he who died at Castel Gandolfo on August 6, 1978. A German bishop, who claims to have proved that Montini was last known to be living not in the Vatican but in the outskirts of Rome, hopes to make this public in a forthcoming book. So could this point to the fact that the genuine Paul VI was held captive in the Vatican, or that he was kidnapped, perhaps murdered? A layman in search of more concrete evidence went to Brescia, where some of Montini's relations were living. Their niece informed him that they were perfectly well aware of the imposture, but that all their efforts to make it known had been stifled. The investigator, who was obviously untried and filled with a crusading zeal to bring things into the open, soon landed in trouble. He was jailed for 4 years, and afterwards deported from Italy. All efforts to trace his whereabouts since then have failed. Well, as part of the prevailing confusion in the Roman stronghold, that is what some far from negligible people have come to believe. Part 12, Murder in the Vatican. No Roman was ever able to say, "I dined last night with the Borgias." Max Beerbohm. A disillusioned priest who, nonetheless, still says Mass daily and fulfills all the duties demanded by a parish, merely shrugged his shoulders when I mentioned the possibility of crimes being perpetrated in the Vatican today. "Well," he said, "such things have always happened there. Why shouldn't they still be going on?" He was not in the least troubled by my suggestion. An enemy of Rome could not have been more casual, more resigned to the use of poison and the strangler's cord, and the acceptance of adultery, in high places. The two complaints of malaria and gout figure among the causes of death of quite a few popes. But sometimes they could be contracted into a single word. Poison, as in the case of Gregory V, who reigned from 996 to 999. The same could be said regarding the death of Damasus II, who, after being elected on July 17, 1048, lived for only 3 weeks. Celestine II, a one-time disciple of Abelard, was made pope on September 26, 1143, and died in the second week of the following March. There were those about him who more than suspected poison. In June 1517 the Medici Pope Leo X narrowly escaped a plot led by Cardinal Petrucci, and 4 other princes of the Church, to poison him. Leo XI died on April 27, 1605, after a reign of only 27 days. His death, according to official biographers, was caused by a sudden chill aggravated by the cares of office. But there were those on hand who had seen him droop over a poison cup. Between those 2 short-lived pontificates, the vice-chancellor of the Roman Church, Rodrigo de Borgia, who was to stamp the period, and his family, with an infamy that was rare at any time, took his seat on the papal throne in 1492 as Alexander VI. as well as several secondary ones, he had already taken as his principal mistress a married Roman lady, Vanozza de Catanese, who presented him with 3 sons and a daughter, all of whom lived under their father's wing as favored members of the court, and from the first, apart from the gestures and protestations that were inescapable parts of his office, the mainspring of Alexander's life became the advancement and political security of his family. The oldest son, Juan, Duke of Gandia, rivaled his father in the number of illicit relationships in which he figured. His brother, Caesar, not a whit behind him in this, was to add his own distinctive brand of crime to the Borgia annals. When he was only 17, Alexander created him cardinal, though Caesar was never more than a subdeacon, certainly not a priest. His papa was equally obliging when Caesar, although a prince of the church, he soon dropped the sham, wanted to marry. The necessary dispensation was soon forthcoming. The youngest of Alexander's sons, Joffre, married an illegitimate daughter of Alonso II of Naples. Then came Lucrezia, who, because of her sex and the manifestly pious strain she exhibited in such surroundings, has been badly treated by novelists and historians of the Hollywood type. She was, according to the time, sufficiently ungirlish to deal with her father's official correspondence when he was out of Rome, and we know nothing definite to her discredit. Her first marriage, to a prince of the Sforza house, was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation. Her second was to another of the illegitimate brood produced by the Neapolitan king, while her third was to Duke Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara. Lucrezia died young, but not before she had passed through the strange experience of knowing that her second husband had been strangled by her brother Caesar. But that was not the highlight of Caesar's career, for he also dealt, in similar fashion, with his own brother Juan. He then turned his attention to cardinals, those with money, and used his ready hands, or the always convenient poison, to account for several, including Cardinal Michel, who was a nephew of Pope Paul II, and Cardinal Orsini. But that by no means depleted the College of Cardinals, for apart from Caesar 4 other members of the Borgia clan sported the red hat. Alexander turned a blind eye on Caesar's exploits, though he was genuinely grieved by the loss of his firstborn, Juan. During this time the devil made his presence felt, sometimes visibly, in Rome, and the populace had no doubt but that the dregs of wickedness were being stirred by doings at the Vatican. For instance, a ballet was performed there on the eve of All Saints, 1501, at which every one of the 50 dancers was a whore picked from the streets of Rome. One of those who came to decide that the Borgias had been in the saddle all too long was Cardinal Castellizzi of Corneto. So he invited father and son to a banquet, and prepared a dose of his own mixing that was guaranteed to rid Rome of them both. They accepted the invitation, but it so happened that Alexander had made up his mind that Castellizzi was a nuisance, and he came provided with some wine that had proved so efficacious in the past. Those were not the days of mixed drinks, but the wines were somehow mixed up as they sat at table, with the result that Alexander and Caesar got a draught of their own preparation. Amid their groaning and twisting, the party hurriedly broke up. Caesar recovered, but Alexander died, duly fortified by the sacraments of the church. Cause of death: malaria. His Eminence of Corneto probably enjoyed a quiet laugh. Caesar made some amends for his evil life by dying in battle. Lucrezia was caricatured in a novel by Victor Hugo, and her name was given to the title role in an opera by Donizetti. An apologist for Alexander could say no more than that during his reign. Greenland accepted the gospel according to a recipe that was handed down and came into the hands of Garelli, who was physician to the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI, 1685 to 1740. The Borgias obtained their poison by first killing a pig, sprinkling its abdominal organs with arsenious acid, and waiting until putrefaction set in. This contaminated matter, when introduced into liquids, became an active, deadly, and, in the majority of cases, almost instantaneous poison. Great precautions were taken at the court of Alexander VI to prevent this being written down, and some of the other methods employed to administer the poison were nothing short of ingenious. A person cutting fruit could die through touching the edge of a knife that had been brushed by the preparation, while the effect of turning a key to open a door or a box might cause a minute graze of the skin through which a fatal drop imperceptibly entered the bloodstream. Other toxicologists affirm that there was another Borgia poison, a complex mixture consisting of a gritty and whitish powder that resembled sugar. It was known as Cantarella or Cantorelli. Illustration from The Broken Cross by Piers Compton. Part 13, Death of Pope John Paul I. Who shall decide when doctors disagree? Alexander Pope. Illustration from The Broken Cross by Piers Compton. Pope John Paul I, September 1978, in seeming good health. The figure of John Paul I, who succeeded Paul VI, adds yet another, and one of the most profound, to a situation that is already crowded with problems. Created bishop by John XXIII, and made a cardinal by Paul VI, the popes who, between them, created and implemented the revolution, his rise to the papal throne after having been Albino Luciano, Cardinal Patriarch of Venice, came almost as an ecclesiastical bolt from the blue. Humbly circumstanced, he grew up in a family where opinions, quite naturally, were formed and dominated by those of the father, a committed left-winger. And he was in his mid-60s when, on August 26, 1978, he emerged from the conclave at which he had been elected, with unprecedented speed. After 4 ballots that covered only 8 hours and 45 minutes on the first day. An observer with an eye on the state of affairs at the Vatican might have noted that the stage was being set for yet another Renaissance drama. And such an event was indeed figured forth by the enigmas at once presented by this apparently, by no means uncommon pope. 2 schools of thought, in neither of which his voice had so far been definitely heard, grew up about him. One insisted that he was bent on continuing the changes set afoot by his 2 predecessors, that he favored the modernist or progressive elements, and their reforms. Support for this was given when he rejected the title of Supreme Pontiff, and elected to be installed rather than crowned. There was no crucifix on the table that served for an altar. At his inaugural Massachusetts simplicity governed all, and those who echoed the ideology of Paul VI were soon claiming that the new pope was their man, especially when he was known to have opposed the church's teaching forbidding contraception. On the other hand, it was said that he contemplated the annulment of some of the innovations started by Vatican II, that he deplored the so-called upward movement that was threatening the church, and those conservatives who looked for an endorsement of their viewpoint were encouraged when the time came to appoint new bishops to vacant sees, and, more especially, one to his old Patriarchate of Venice. In that he was opposed by Cardinal Baggio, known as Seba to the Secret societies, whose candidate was a certain Monsignor CE, who was known to be radical. But John Paul refused to make the appointment, thus giving support to those who wished to believe that he was in conflict with heresy. Their satisfaction, however, was short-lived, as was evidenced by an occasion when he, the future Pope John Paul I, was called upon to address a gathering of students and teachers. He led them in reciting the Angelus, but no sooner had he concluded the last Hail Mary than he began to sing the praises of one whom he extolled as a classical example of abnegation and devotion to education. This was not, as might have been expected, a saint, nor even a simple member of the Church, but Giosuè Carducci, 1835–1907, who had been professor at Bologna University and whose name, as a self-confessed worshipper of Satan, was widely respected in occult circles. His poem Hymn to Satan, in 40 stanzas, contains such lines as the following: Glory to thee, magnanimous rebel! On thy brow shall rise, like laurel groves, the forests of Aspromonte. I drink to the happy day which shall see the end of Rome the eternal. To liberty who, avenging human thought, overturns the false throne of Peter's successor. In the dust with crowns and garlands lie shattered, iniquitous Lord. In shorter pieces, Carducci apologized to Satan, or the spirit of evil, which he called Agramanio, for the lies and slanders that are heaped upon him on earth. Glorifications of the occult and the Black Mass, and of Satan as the symbol of revolt against the Church, the antithesis of religion, are mixed with blasphemies. Satan is thanked for being kind, while in his ode to the town of Ferrara, Carducci cursed the cruel old she-wolf of the Vatican. Carducci became the center of a cult, and was accorded much the same reverence by his followers that he gave to Satan. Processions were held, preceded by a banner on which Satan, in all his regalia of horns, tail, and hooves, was depicted, and at which a parody of the litany, including the line Gloria in profundis Satani, was chanted. The last 8 verses of the hymn by this singer of Satan passed into the repertory of songs that made the rafters ring in Italian secret society meetings. Yet Pope John Paul's admiration for this man, his holding him up as an example for teachers and the rising generation to follow, was only one of the mysteries connected with his reign. Over the centuries Rome, insisting on her unique historical validity, had remained stubbornly aloof from negotiations with other churches, Protestant or Orthodox. But the Second Vatican Council had opened doors so that representatives of those churches were now exchanging views and discussing the possibilities of unity. One such visitor to Rome was the Russian Metropolitan Monsignor Nicodim, the Orthodox Archbishop of Leningrad. Born in 1930, and becoming the youngest bishop of any creed in Christendom, he was reputed to exhibit a pro-Soviet and anti-West bias. In 1961 he led a deputation of Orthodox churchmen to the World Council of Churches. He was awarded the United Nations Medal for Peace, and became head of the Foreign Relations Department of the Moscow Patriarchate. And after attending the installation of John Paul I, he was received in audience by the Pope on September 5. The meeting occurred in the study adjoining the Pope's private library, and the opening remarks, as reported probably by Father Arapi, Superior General of the Jesuits, or by the liberal Cardinal Willebrands, who acted as hosts to Nicodim, followed these lines: "Welcome, dear brother," said the Pope, coming forward from the large oak table at which he had been working, "so close to us, and yet so far away. What shall we discover about ourselves? When will all of us Catholic and Orthodox, be sons of the same church. Nicodim responded in the same spirit. I wish it could be in your reign that such a thing could happen. The Pope asked for news of the state of religion in Russia. Father Arapi tells me that you are very hopeful about the future of the church in your country. Nicodim was silent for a time. Those who had met him could imagine how, when pausing for an answer, his eyes showed as little more than slits under bushy brows. Most Holy Father, I'll be frank with you, he said at length. In Russia they think very badly of me. They say I am working with the state authorities, and that I serve them rather than God. Yet I am a faithful servant of God. That short confession brought a rush of color to his cheeks. He breathed quickly, in the grip of some violent emotion. John Paul asked quietly, what do you wish me to do? When able to speak again, Nicodim continued, Most Holy Father, how can we work together if Russia still thinks that the Orthodox Church is part of the communist system? One day I shall be crushed. He flung out his arms and the Russian Orthodox Church will come to an end. You must come to an understanding, and negotiate with them as they ask you to. Had that been the object of Nicodim's visit? We shall never know, for by now his physical state was truly alarming. His hand was pressed to his left side, as though, it was later said, perhaps by John Paul himself, he wished to tear out his heart and fling it at the Pope's feet. He tried to speak, but failed. His mouth twisted, and only the whites of his eyes were visible. The Pope seized and partly supported him. Mercy, he is ill, he exclaimed to Willebrands, who was still within hearing. Quickly, Eminence, call Dr. Fontana, the Pope's private physician. The Pope arranged what comfort he could for Nicodim on the floor of the study. Then he opened the window. By the time the doctor arrived, the Russian was dead. It later emerged that Nicodim had been refused permission to enter France on his way to Rome, and that he was only able to do so when a number of French bishops interceded on his behalf. Then, as though to account for their opposition, the French Foreign Office let it be known that Nicodim was an accredited agent of the Soviet secret police. Thursday, the 28th of September, 1978, had been what passed as an ordinary day at the Vatican. The Pope, after working in his office, had received some members of the hierarchy in private audience, and then a group of prelates from the Philippines, to whom, as representatives of the most Catholic region in Southeast Asia, he extended a special welcome. Following lunch, and the usual siesta, there was more business and discussion with several of the cardinals. Evening prayers in his private chapel had been followed by a general good night to members of his staff, after which he retired to his bedroom on the third floor of the Apostolic Palace. Friday dawned as a typical end of September day, with the rows of palace windows taking shape in the dull gray light and the first sounds coming, not from birds in the Vatican gardens, but from the little room where Sister Vicenza, a nun who had been in the service of popes for the past 10 years, was preparing coffee. Her timing, her movements, and the details of her task had an almost military precision. It had turned 5 o'clock. At 10 minutes past she would place the cup of coffee, always strong, in the sacristy adjoining the chapel where the Pope knelt in meditation, before saying Mass at 5:30. She was therefore surprised when, not hearing any movement, she had gone to the sacristy and found that the coffee, half cold in the cup, had not been touched. One of the papal secretaries, Don Diego, then joined her, and when 5:20 came, and still the Pope had not appeared. They went to the door of his bedroom. There the secretary tapped, more than once, and having received no answer he opened the door. The Pope lay on his bed, fully dressed, and obviously dead. On the bedside table was a lamp, still burning, and a cheap little alarm clock that he had brought from Venice. In the corridor was a red light emanating from an electric bell. It was placed there as an alarm, to summon help, and its glow meant that such a signal had been made by the Pope who, as Diego saw at a glance, had died alone, without his call being answered. He had worn the fisherman's ring for only 33 days. The Pope's other secretary, Father John McGee, was next on the scene, and as the news spread, Cardinal Confalonier, Dean of the Congregation of Cardinals, who arrived at the bedside, pronounced what was afterwards accepted as the regular and official version of the tragedy. The resulting description might relate to the deathbed of any outstandingly religious man. The Pope was on the bed, supported by pillows, with his head turned a little to the right, inclining forward over his chest. His eyes were open. The prevailing impression was one of calmness and serenity, with no suggestion of pain. There was nothing to belie the name Smiling Pope that had been given him during his brief time in Rome. One hand held some sheets of paper containing notes for a speech he intended to deliver on the following day. A copy of Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ was on the floor. In the near panic and stupefaction that followed, Don Diego, who might have been expected to join in, was holding a hurriedly excited conversation on the telephone. It later transpired that he had called Dr. Antonio de Ros, begging him to come at once to the Vatican to carry out an external examination of John Paul, whom he had known and treated for some 20 years, an extraordinary act for a secretary to carry out on his own initiative, when he was surrounded by a bevy of influential prelates, and doubly surprising since Dr. de Ros was not in Rome, but in Venice. The news was released through Vatican Radio at 7:31, and on Italian radio the morning's announcer cut short the latest act of terrorism by the Red Brigade to say, "We interrupt this broadcast to bring you grave news." The tolling of bells throughout the city, and the lowering of the yellow and white Vatican City flag, took up the story, and away in Krakow, when the tidings were heard in the old building that housed the cathedral curia, a man who had been seated at breakfast suddenly rose and retired to the private chapel. Those who saw him at the time remembered how Karol Wojtyla, for that was his name, was deathly pale and trembling, as though some heavily charged mission, whose import had been made known to him by some secret council in the not too far off past, was on the point of reaching fulfillment. Those who experienced it have no hesitation in saying that from then on an atmosphere, hitherto unknown there, passed into the Vatican. Men began almost to question themselves, as they did others. Small groups met, and talked without animation. They were under a nameless pressure that it was beyond the power of any among them to remove. Much of the conversation there, at normal times, is highly elusive, causing one to search into their classical, historical, or literary memories to find a reason for it, or an answer. Now that impression was heightened, as when Cardinals Poletti and Baggio came face to face, both aware of a question, and both equally nervous lest the other might solve it. One of them took refuge in recalling the words of Antonio Fogazzaro, the anti-clerical writer. "Eminence," said one, "you jeer at anyone who holds his tongue. Dread his silence." A less experienced priest came nearer to summing up the situation in more picturesque language. The cupboards of the Vatican are full of skeletons. Their bones are beginning to rattle. What if they are, said another cleric. They were placed there during the great heresies of the Middle Ages. Now those heresies have come again. Rumors, mystery, embarrassment, perplexity. It came almost as a relief. When movements were heard in the hallway that led to the Pope's bedroom. The Swiss guards, before the termination of their 4 hours duty there, were marching out, and a high temporary partition was being erected round the bed. At the same time, all exits and entrances to that part of the building were sealed. Before long the dead Pope's brother and sister, Eduardo and Amelia Luciani, and a niece Pia, had arrived. They were plain, simple people, who would be regarded, by some in Rome, as rugged sons and daughters of the mountains. They came from the Dolomites, and not the sort to impress, in spite of their closeness to the dead Pope, a cardinal like Villatte who, now in charge of Vatican affairs and worldly to a degree, covered an iron nature with a more than usual share of French courtesy. Worried by the sudden and unexpected death of their brother, they voiced their agreement, with most of the doctors, that an autopsy must be held to settle the matter and dispel any lingering doubts. Professor Prati, consultant of the heart unit of St. Camillo Hospital, said an autopsy was not only desirable, but necessary. Professor Alcona, head of the neurological department of the Polyclinic of the Catholic University of Rome, gave his more downright opinion that it was the duty of the Holy See to order a post-mortem. The same theme was to be more strongly renewed after the Pope's funeral when another specialist, Professor Fontana, said, "If I had to certify, under the same circumstances, the death of an ordinary unimportant citizen, I would quite simply have refused to allow him to be buried." Many publications were equally insistent that a post-mortem was necessary. Among them being the conservative group Civiltà Cristiana, under its director Franco Antico, and the influential Corriere della Sera, of Milan. Their doubts were supported by the way in which the specialists, who examined the Pope's body, contradicted each other. Dr. Buzzanetti, the first doctor on the scene, said the Pope had suffered an acute coronary thrombosis. Another put it down to cancer, while a third said the Pope had an apoplectic fit resulting from a brain tumor. Dr. Rulli of the St. Camillo Hospital said it was a case of cerebral hemorrhage. The suggestion of heart trouble was discountenanced by Eduardo and Amelia Luciani, while Monsignor Sinigalia said that John Paul, acting on his advice, had had an electrocardiogram which lasted for 20 minutes, and that no irregularity had been revealed. The official investigators now adopted a new line to help them out of an embarrassing situation. They suddenly announced that the Pope had, from the first, been a very sick person, that he had been baptized soon after birth since he had not been expected to live through the day, that he had been in hospital 8 times, in a sanatorium twice, and had undergone 4 operations. Appendicitis, heart, and sinus trouble, with swelling of the hands and feet, were also numbered. Among his complaints, his fingernails had turned black, he had managed to survive with a single lung, while there was also talk of an embolism, or blood clot. If this summary of ills had been true, and he underwent the usual medical examination before the conclave, he would not have been elected. Within a few hours, when the initial feeling of shock had been past, a veritable campaign of suspicion made itself felt, from which only Villatte, and a few of his close associates stayed aloof. There was talk of a more than medicinal dose of digitalis, of the rare wickedness that would be necessary to introduce poison into the wine used for Mass, and of the unobtrusive ways in which a man might be helped to die. But these hazards apart, with such terms as murder, assassination, and poison beginning to be heard, there were some unanswerable questions that were threatening, as one prelate put it, to shake the pillars of the Vatican to their very foundations. The first one to look on the face of the dead Pope was Don Diego, a secretary. He must have seen something that thoroughly alarmed or shocked him, since he had rushed to the telephone to call Dr. de Ros, a more intimate medical friend of John Paul than any on the Vatican Rota, although the average of 14 prominent specialists it numbered were readily available, while de Ros was 300 miles away. Moreover, Don Diego was never asked to account for his action, or, at least, not in a way that was ever the subject of any known inquiry. And, normally loquacious, he became reserved, and could never be drawn to enlarge upon the reason why, with so much threatening to break about him, he rushed to the telephone to make a distant call. What had he seen? Had it been the expression on the face of John Paul? According to the octogenarian dean of the Congregation of Cardinals Confiloniae, the dead man appeared serene, smooth, peaceful, with a hint of smiling. But a young cleric who had recently been accredited to the Vatican, and who pressed forward with a beginner's eagerness and ardor to make himself familiar with its affairs, saw a very different countenance from the one officially described. It was distorted by a pronounced look of suffering, while the mouth, instead of presaging a smile, was gaping wide. That this latter version was true was borne out when the embalmers arrived, the four brothers Signorixi from the Medical Institute. Their combined and highly practiced efforts, carried out for 2 hours on the face alone, and with the aid of cosmetics, could not overcome, still less remove, the manifestation of horror that the dead Pope carried to his tomb. But the greatest obstacle, in the way of a comfortable explanation, was the red light in the corridor. It was controlled by an electric bell on the Pope's bedside table, and it was a signal that meant he was calling for assistance. That signal had certainly been made. The red glow had sprung into life. But it had not been answered. Not by any of the guards, nor by any of the staff, the secretaries, clerks, nurse, the chauffeur, who were in the Anexa, not by either of the 7 nuns of the Order of Marie Enfant who, being responsible for the Pope's domestic arrangements, were on the floor above his own. What had they all been doing at the time? What more important task than the Pope's welfare, his safety even, had kept them employed? The police who patrolled St. Peter's Square, all through the night, must instinctively have glanced more than once at the slightly parted curtains in the Pope's bedroom. The red glow might have appeared between them. But was it indeed observable all through the night, or had it been tampered with so that it only became visible at early dawn? There was no inquiry along those lines. Those questions went unanswered. The Pope was dead. But a post-mortem, demanded by most of the Pope's doctors and his relatives, and seconded by an influential press, would settle all doubts as well as determining the cause of death. But here again the tall imposing presence of Villot intervened. An autopsy, he declared, was out of the question, and his reason for saying so left the doctors more bewildered than before. The body had been found at 5:30 a.m. time. That is normally so regular and methodically paced at the Vatican, had then taken a surprising leap forward. For the embalmers, with quite unnecessary and unprecedented haste, had immediately been summoned, and their process had been completed by 9:30. But the intestines, asked one of the doctors, who had made up his mind to remove them and carry out tests for a trace of poison. Vilat's answer was again decisive. They had been burnt. One of the most salient comments on the strange affair came, surprisingly enough, from El Osservatore Romano, which asked whether the death of John Paul might in any way be linked to the homily he had pronounced in favor of the Satanist and devil worshipper Carducci. But only Catholics in Germany read this, for it was deleted from every copy of the paper that went elsewhere. An effort was actually made to suppress the German edition, but it was too late. An unimpressive press conference, that Vilat could not actually oppose, though his obvious displeasure almost had the effect of a positive ban, especially when one of those present voiced the widespread regret at the failure to hold an autopsy, yielded nothing. Vilat referred objectors to the final verdict given by Father Romeo Panzarelli, who, after carrying out whatever check was possible on the highly spiced and eviscerated body, was pleased to report that everything had been in order. Meanwhile, a medical man, Geron, who rejected the possibility of the Pope's death having been a natural one, openly pronounced the word poison, and a bishop, one must respect his wish to remain unnamed, made up his mind to succeed where doctors, professors, and journalists had failed. He would penetrate the veil of silence and secrecy, and establish the truth, whatever its import or what it might entail. He worked hard and long, interviewed countless people, delved into every department, mounted stairways, and passed through devious passages in the Vatican. Then, for a time, he vanished from the scene, and those who have since met him found him not only changed, as may happen after only a few months, but in every sense an entirely different man. Hardened Romans and realists, who had expected nothing else, merely shrugged. The dome of St. Peter's is not an eggshell, to be cracked. He was merely one more fool who had cracked his own heart against it. Cardinal Vilat, aware of the growing disquiet in the Church, promised to make a statement on recent events in the Vatican before the calling of the next conclave. He never did, but remained a man of mystery to the last, leaving no evidence as to how much he had known. There was ample suspicion to more than make up for absence of certainty, or for how much he had been responsible. The cause of Vilat's own death on March 9, 1979, occasioned the same elementary confusion that surrounded the passing of John Paul I. The cardinal, according to an early announcement, had died of bronchial pneumonia. A second verdict named kidney trouble, a third, hepatitis, while yet another attributed the cause to internal hemorrhage. It appears that top-flight Catholic specialists, when called to the bedside of their most eminent patients, reveal themselves as being very indifferent. Diagnostic Ians. It was raining. From their places on the colonnade above the piazza, Simon Peter and his fellow saints looked down upon a forest of umbrellas. The dead Pope, in vestments of red, white, and gold, and with a golden mitre on his head, had been brought from the Clementine Hall in the Apostolic Palace to the square, where, in a plain cypress coffin, the body rested on a red blanket fringed with ermine, for the celebration of an open-air mass. The flame of a single tall taper, placed near the coffin, flickered this way and that in the wind and drizzle, but never to the point of going out. A Monsignor, his mind heavy with a fast-growing certainty, looked round at the mostly shawled heads and white faces, and thought of the terrible suspicion that was trembling on everyone's lips. "It is too much," was all he could murmur to himself. It is too much. A chill October dusk, pierced by pinpoints of light from the city, was closing down as the cortege moved into the basilica where, in the crypt, future generations will come to gaze at a tomb bearing the simple inscription, Johannes Paulus I. And some, despite the blunting of time, may wonder. Part 14. John Paul II. Belief in the innocence of rulers depends upon the ignorance of those ruled. Hugh Ross Williamson. The Catholic world at large had barely recovered from the shock of John Paul's death, sudden and unexpected as it was, when another event diverted their attention from the sedis vacantia, vacancy of the Apostolic See, to the puff of white smoke that, on October 16, 1978, issued from the small bent chimney of the Sistine Chapel, and to the announcement that followed it, "We have a new Pope." More than the usual excitement resulted, and there were those among the more experienced observers who noted that much of it came from the same quarters that had acclaimed John XXIII, from those who greeted the changes, or disasters, as many thought, that resulted from his reign, as long-awaited and welcome signs that the Church was throwing off its iron archaic fetters. For the new pontiff was Karol Wojtyla, who received something like a hero's welcome because he was a Pole, from behind the Iron Curtain, where religion, especially the Christian, had to run the gauntlet, and where now, although the era of blows and taunts was somewhat relaxed, it was still subject to a mainly wary and restricted acceptance. Wojtyla was, incidentally, the first non-Italian to be elected pope since 1522. A veteran American journalist who had the not inappropriate name of Avro Manhattan, who knew the Vatican more intimately than he did the White House, and who was well versed in Russian tergiversation, had earlier written, "The proportion of radical cardinals, and of future members of the Sacred College, whose political leanings range from light pink to scarlet red, has been mounting and will continue to increase. The inevitable result will be that, thanks to the greatest number of leftist clerics, the election of a red pope is becoming more likely one." Had such a pontiff arrived in the person of Karol Wojtyla? In view of the strained relationship between countries in the West, and those behind the Iron Curtain, the officially irreligious policy of the latter, and the emergence of John Paul II as the new pope elected to be called, a number of questions presented themselves that called for an answer. His orthodox early training and development, his becoming a priest, and his rise to archbishop and then to cardinal, had proceeded normally. http://biblioteka.leg.net/vatican/broken cross/images/image01.jpg. Many hundreds of his co-religionists in Poland during the 30 years of communist domination had undergone petty or serious persecution, many being jailed, some put to death. Yet there is no indication of Wojtyla ever undergoing more than the usual trials that have to be endured by known dissidents. He had not been subject to any sustained or menacing outcry, and his relationship with the Marxist authorities had been the same as that of any ordinary citizen who wore his faith upon his sleeve. Through it all he must have been called upon, as a prelate, to give not only religious but also social, and even economic advice to those of his faith, advice that must have sometimes conflicted with the governing code. Yet he was never actually silenced, and he was tolerated, even privileged by the authorities, while his religious superior, Cardinal Wyszynski, then primate of Poland, lived under constant pressure. A case in point was the granting of permission to leave the country. When the Synod of Bishops was called for Rome, both cardinals applied for exit visas. The primate encountered a blunt refusal, but Wojtyla was given permission as a matter of course. He experienced the same favor when it came to attending the conclave at which he was elected, and those who had been dismayed by the prospect of a pope from a Soviet background soon felt they were justified. Pierre Bourgranin, writing in Didesco, a French publication that appeared in Brussels, April 1979, said, "No one capable of coherent thought will easily believe that a cardinal from behind the Iron Curtain can be anything but a communist plant." A similar doubt was expressed in The War Is Now, an Australian production, issued on behalf of Catholic tradition. If Wojtyla, it asked, is a true Catholic Pole, why would proper, sensible, prudent cardinals with the Church's welfare at heart, elect a target, a man whose family and people remain under the gun, a whole nation of ready-made hostages or martyrs? The Abbé de Nantes, leader of the Catholic Counter-Reformation of the 20th century, was more downright. "We have a communist pope." It was formerly acknowledged that differences, when they were in Poland, did exist between the two cardinals. Wyszynski never yielded an inch when dealing with the controllers of his country. Wojtyla was all for coming to terms and continuing dialogue with them, along the lines that had been established by Paul VI, and what was more noticeable, Wojtyla, apart from never actually condemning atheistic Marxism, stood in the way of those who wished to adopt a more militant attitude towards it. Someone had noted that during the conclave in the Sistine Chapel, at which he was elected, the solemnity of the occasion, and the fact of being overlooked by Michelangelo's gigantic frescoes of the Last Judgment, did not prevent Wojtyla reading from a book that he had thought fit to take in for instruction or for a little light relief from the gravity of choosing the Vicar of Christ. It was a book of Marxist principles. Those who regarded him with suspicion were not reassured when he rejected the ritual of coronation and chose to be installed, and when he let it be known that he rested more easily in an ordinary chair than on the papal throne. Were church practices, they asked, to undergo a further paring down after those that had already resulted from the council? Their fears grew when he put aside the mantle of authoritarianism with which the Church, of which he was now the head, had hitherto been invested. And any lingering doubts they may have had vanished when, in his inaugural speech, he undertook to fulfill the last will and testament of Paul VI, by adhering to Pope John's directives of collegiality and the liturgy of the new Mass, and that, it may be observed, in spite of the fact that he must have been aware of all the obscenities that followed it. When making that announcement, Wojtyla stood by a makeshift altar that, like Paul VI's bier, was bereft of any religious sign in the form of a crucifix or cross. Other indications of what might be expected of the new pope soon followed. In his first encyclical he praised Paul VI for having revealed the true countenance of the Church. He spoke in a similar vein of the Second Vatican Council, which had given greater visibility to the Eucharistic sacrifice, and he undertook to follow and promote the renewal of the Church according to the spirit of the Council. A later statement referred to that council as having been the greatest ecclesiastical event of our century, and it now remained to secure the acceptance of fulfillment of Vatican II in accordance with its authentic content. In doing this we are guided by faith. We believe that Christ, through the Holy Spirit, was with the Council Fathers. That the Church contains, within its magisterium, what the Spirit says to the Church, saying it at the same time in harmony with tradition and according to the demands posed by the signs of the times. His remark on being in harmony with tradition was flatly contradicted by his admission that the liturgy of the Mass is different from the one known before the Council. But, he added significantly, we do not intend to speak of those differences. It was essential to renew the Church in structure and function, to bring it into line with the needs of the contemporary world, and from that admission it needed but a step for Wojtyla to emphasize the revolutionary principles of 1789, with the glorification of man, liberated man, as a being who is sufficient unto himself. Man was the only idol deserving the reverence of those on earth, his stature being confirmed by and classified as the rights of man. That somewhat hazy terrestrial belief has been the inspiration of every left-wing movement from then on. With a fine disregard for the authority of law, it was proclaimed, in America, that liberty is the very foundation of political order. While a few years ago François Mitterrand, the communist who is now President of the French Republic, said that man is the future of man. It was then left for Karol Wojtyla, as John Paul II, to enshrine that belief in a modern religious setting by declaring that man is the primary issue of the Church, a papal announcement that is thoroughly in line with the Marxist principle that man is an end in himself and the explanation of all things. The Pope then proceeded to pass from verbal to more active approval of the political system from which he had emerged. Speaking of the Church in Poland, he said that its relationship with communism could be one of the elements in the ethical and international order in Europe and the modern world. He maintained a friendly understanding with the Red occupiers of his country, and thought it possible to open up a spiritual détente with them. In furtherance of this, the Communist Minister of State, Jablonski, with a train of comrades as large as that of any Eastern potentate, was received at the Vatican. Then came the Soviet minister, Gromyko, who was granted more than the prescribed time with His Holiness. He greeted guerrillas between their bouts of freedom fighting in Africa and Nicaragua. His moral support went with them. He opened the door of his study to the Mexican José Alvarez, who traveled far and wide in South America, calling on extremists to light the flames of anarchy. Not even the Pope's intimates knew what passed between them. He was the star speaker at a Latin American Congress in Panama City, where the theme was certainly not religious, since the organizers were the communist dictator, General Torrijos, and the Marxist Sergio Méndez Arceo, of Cuernavaca. When addressing a group of refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the Pope's lukewarm attitude was commented on by Robert Serrault, the Paris Match correspondent. The Pope, naturally enough, had commiserated with his audience, but why, asked Serrault, had he not so much as mentioned the Red Terror from which they had escaped? In view of that failure to condemn tyranny, it is remarkable that one of the few strictures uttered by John Paul II has been directed against those Catholics who deplore the gradual taking to pieces of the Church since Vatican II. Those who remain attached to incidental aspects of the Church, which were more valid in the past but have now been superseded, cannot be considered the faithful. His orthodoxy, when it came to the teaching of Catholicism and its relation to other religions, has also been called into question. It is a commonplace, but no belittlement of Islam, to point out that the fatalistic Arabian tradition, with its denial of Christ's divinity and of the redemption, is a far remove from the essentials of Christian belief. Yet the Pope told an audience of Muslims that their Quran and the Bible are in step. And in more casual mood, was he pandering to the mechanical spirit of the age. when he told a gathering of motorists to have the same care for their cars as they have for their souls? Or was it by a slip of the tongue that the importance attached to cars preceded that of souls? One of the Pope's letters, dated September 15, 1981, on the subject of private property and capitalism, shows a marked contradiction of and a departure from the Church's teaching. For in the letter he says, Christian tradition has never upheld the right of private property as absolute and untouchable. On the contrary, it has always understood the right as common to all to use the goods of the whole creation. That is so blatantly false, and so opposed to what every pope from Leo XIII to Pius XII had said, that one is tempted to agree with those outspoken trans-Atlantic critics too who bluntly call Karol Wojtyla a liar, and who follow that up with the exhortation, break off, Charlie. For here I quote from Leo XIII. The socialists endeavor to destroy private property, and maintain that the individual possessions should become the common property of all, to be administered by the state or by municipal bodies. It is unjust, because it would rob the legal possessor, bring the state into a sphere that is not its own, and cause complete confusion to the community. Leo went on to say that a man works in order to obtain property, and to hold it as his own private possession. For every man has the right by nature to possess property of his own. This is one of the distinct points between man and the animal creation. The authority of the divine law adds its sanction, forbidding us in the gravest terms even to covet that which is another's. From Pius XI. The primary function of private property is in order that individuals may be able to provide for their own needs and for those of their families. And from Pius XII. The Church aspires to bring it about that private ownership shall become, in accordance with the plans of the divine wisdom and with the laws of nature, an element in the social system, a necessary incentive to human enterprise, and a stimulus to nature. All this for the benefit of the temporal and spiritual ends of life, and consequently for the benefit of the freedom and dignity of man. And still from the same Pope. Only private ownership can provide the head of a family with the healthy freedom it requires to carry out the duties allotted to him by the Creator for the physical, spiritual, and religious well-being of his family. Side by side with these proclamations, the Church has issued warnings against liberalism, which ends in capitalism, and against Marxism, which preaches the abolition of private property. Therefore the statement made by John Paul II may be seen to be extraordinary compared with many of those made by his predecessors. 2. During his early life in Krakow, both as student and as a young priest, Wojtyla acquired a liking for the theater that has never left him. It began when he joined a school dramatic group, and later, during the war when Poland was occupied, what is often referred to as a subterranean theater, which means that rehearsals and performances took place in a room, sometimes the kitchen of an apartment, secretly and by candlelight. It was round about that time, says one of his biographers, that he formed a sentimental attachment to a young woman. And from then on she has followed him like a shadow, by rumor, newspaper report, and in the conversation of Polish exiles on both sides of the Atlantic. Sometimes the details differed. The most unlikely version, that was probably put out to engage sympathy, was that she worked against the Germans, had been discovered, and shot. Another gives the date 1940 as marking the height of their attachment. According to Blazinski, who was born in Poland, the future pope was popular with the girls and had a steady girlfriend. His love of entertainment extended to the cinema, and to such superficial mock religious shows as Jesus Christ Superstar. After one performance of the latter, he spoke for 20 minutes to the audience on the theme of love and joy. He encouraged the adolescent bawling and aimless strumming of guitars that, in the name of popular accompaniments, make some present-day masses unbearable to many. In the same spirit, he invited the American evangelist, Billy Graham, to preach one of his red-hot sermons in the Church of St. Anne, Krakow. One of the subjects discussed by the circle in which he moved was a book by the writer Zgadlois, which had been frowned upon by the Church because of its obsession with sex, while an early piece of writing by Wojtyla, translated by Boleslaw Taberski and quoted by Blazinski, contains such lines as love carries people away like an absolute. Sometimes human existence seems too short for love. The same theme occurred in Wojtyla's book Love and Responsibility, 1960, which, Blazinski says, does not ignore the bodily reality of man and woman, and goes into considerable detail in describing both the physiology and psychology of sex, the latter often with a great deal of insight that might seem surprising in one who is now, after all, a celibate clergyman. Even when Wojtyla became pope, the ghost of the mystery woman who had haunted his student days was not laid. There are those among Polish exiles who claim to have known her, and one of the most downright rumors spread is that her name is Edwidge. But be that as it may, not even Wojtyla's apologists can deny that he has shown more interest in human sexuality than any pope since the Middle Ages. Many listeners to an address he gave in Rome were quite embarrassed when he launched into details on lust and the nakedness of the body. Some of his own statements have given publicity agents ample scope to enlarge upon them. Young people of France, he cried to a far from mature audience in Paris, bodily union has always been the strongest language that two people can say to each other. Those words have been called some of the most stupefying ever spoken by a pope. During his visit to Kisangani in Zaire, Africa, a correspondent in Newsweek shook his head sadly over the way in which the head of the Roman Church dispensed with formality. In humid heat, and almost as soon as he stepped from the plane, he was seen grinning, sweating, swaying, and stomping with dancing girls. He has been photographed watching a group of adolescent girls in one-piece garments that reached well above the knee carry out a series of acrobatic dances. Another picture has recently come to hand in which, at Castel Gandolfo, he watches a young dancer perform convolutions in front of him, with her head and face almost lost sight of in a flurry of white underclothes. A play written by Wojtyla, The Jeweller's Shop, was produced at the Westminster Theatre in May, 1982. Said to be written in purple prose, the producer hoped that the play should draw the punters as well as the church audiences. His hope may well be realized since the play, still quoting the Daily Telegraph, April 28, 1982, embraces the unlikely subject of prostitution for 3. There is no need for John Paul II to enter deeply into the differences in the Church resulting from Vatican II. It has been said that he is walking with a rose in his hand, that is, until the early gains achieved by John XXIII and Paul VI have been consolidated. The once proud boast relating to the one true Church has diminished into a spineless acknowledgement of these ecumenical days. The claim of papal authority, which has yielded place to the idea of power sharing with bishops, may remain on the Church's statute books for a while longer, but the force of its divine origin has been watered down, and the altars always a sign of whatever gods may be, have been demolished. http://bibliotecaPeliads.leg.net/vatican/broken cross/images/image07b.jpg. Even so, the next phase of the attack upon the Church from within has passed beyond its preparatory stages and is already underway. It is likely to be less spectacular than the earlier depredations. The word revisionary will be heard more often than change. The churches will no longer be used as amatory playgrounds. Yet what is likely to result from meetings in the Vatican Synod Hall, between more than 70 cardinals and bishops, will probably, in the long run, be quite as devastating as the innovations that have now been accepted as norms by a largely unperceptive and uncritical public. Among the subjects that are known to have been discussed are marriage and abortion, and prelates such as Cardinal Felici are rational enough to admit that the issues on these, and similar questions, have virtually been decided in advance. Marriage annulments, robbed of much of their earlier formality, will be made easier. The threat of excommunication will be lifted from women who undergo abortion, and, a still greater earnest of more and vital concessions to come, the Articles of Canon Law will be reduced from numbering 2,414 to a possible 1,728. But these considerations will not weigh heavily on those who are likely to be impressed by the Pope's visit to this country in May this year, 1982. The power of Mr. Mark McCormack's International Management Group has been invoked to provide the same publicity for a pope that it has so ably done for golfers, baseball toughs, and tennis players, while a firm of business consultants, Papal Visits Limited, will add further promotional backing. The proven dramatic instinct of John Paul II will doubtless come into play as, scattering blessings from a glass-topped vehicle, he rides slowly between miles of fencing, stands, marquees, and press platforms, and over carpet decorated with thousands of plants, to where 3 crosses, the tallest 120 feet high. No, Mr. McCormack, Calvary was not like that rise above a steel and canvas altar structure. After Mass, the faithful may come away with a screwdriver that bears a sticker showing the Pope's head on its handle. All arrangements for the visit will be in the capable hands of Archbishop Marcinkus, who has obviously been washed clean of the somewhat doubtful reputation that clung to him in Rome. 1. The Vatican-Moscow Alliance, 1977. 2. The publishers of Veritas, an Orthodox newsletter. Louisville, Kentucky, USA. 3. George Blazinski and John Paul II, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, 1979. Some of the incidents related here are taken from that book. 4. English theater critics did not exactly acclaim the Pope's efforts as a playwright-editor. Finale. Yeri a bad lot, a blackguard, in the likes of a living man. I was thus greeted by an Irish priest early one crisp April morning. He had read in manuscript much of what I have here written, and while he could not confute it, he thought that I was doing the church a sorry service. He was a big, broad-shouldered man, with sad eyes and a knobbed stick that he swung as though it were a shillelagh. We were standing within the shadow of St. Peter's, while the blinds were still drawn in the palace windows, and only isolated footsteps sounded on the piazza. His hint of humorous menace contrasted with the serenity of my feelings. For there is nothing more golden in the world than a Roman dawn. Gold dust, lighting the past more surely than it does the present, filters through the air and settles, like a hesitant touch, on Materna's fagade with its bold Roman letters, turning its brown and ochre tints into gold. Dust motes, where the first light catches them, are turned into gold that touches the base of Caligula's obelisk and breaks in splendor over the cobbles, over the statues of the saints, on the colonnade, and the dome that gradually wears to white, over the space before the basilica surrounded by Bernini's giant columns, as once the legions surrounded the levelled spears that rose in envy of the Roman water from the fountains, whenever a breeze ruffles it, falls away in drops of gold. The angle of the stick was inviting me to look over Vatican Hill. That's the way dawn will come, over the city, over the church. Don't you believe it? I only half nodded. What you've written will pass, like a holiday or a slow fever. But the promise that was given to Peter, and he pointed to the central figure on the colonnade, will not pass. It cannot. The fissure in the rock will be closed. Dawn will come again. Don't you believe it? Yes, I agreed, influenced perhaps by his sad eyes and the swing of his shillelagh. Dawn will come again. But will it be a false dawn? Appendix. The strange death of Roberto Calvi. Hard upon the upheaval caused by the collapse of Michel Sindena's financial empire, and the revelations concerning membership of the Masonic Lodge propaganda to Oriental Rite, the Vatican faced a third embarrassment when on June 18, 1982, the body of banker Roberto Calvi was discovered hanging from scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge. Calvi had been the president of Italy's biggest private bank, the Ambrosiano, which took over many of Sindena's assets. Sometimes known as God's banker because of his close connection with Vatican finance, the Vatican Bank was a large shareholder in the Ambrosiano. In May of the above year he faced a number of charges related to, among others, illegal currency transactions. He vanished from Rome and arrived in London, where he took accommodation in Chelsea Cloisters, on June 15. He was a frightened man, burdened with secrets connected with his own and the Vatican Bank, into which it was not wise to probe too deeply. Some who had tried were suddenly dismissed from their posts, others went to jail on fake charges, and there had been at least one known shooting affair during investigations. While Calvi was absent, his secretary, who had been with the bank for 30 years, wrote a note cursing Calvi and then threw herself, so the authorities said, from the fourth floor of the bank's headquarters in Milan. In London, Calvi treated his chauffeur as a bodyguard. He arranged with a friend to call at his flat at regular intervals, and then to knock 3 times for entrance. He also shaved off his mustache, which he had worn for years. But although disinclined to leave his apartment, Calvi, it was said, had nonetheless walked 4 miles in the night or early morning, to commit suicide in the unlikely area of Blackfriars. The mention of that area calls for comment, together with a reminder that secret societies lay great stress on association and symbols. Blackfriars was the site of the friary and church of the Dominican order, members of which acquired the name of Blackfriars because of their habit. They were, and still are, known as the Order of Preachers. As such they brought the pulpit into general use, and pulpits figure in the stonework of Blackfriars Bridge. And members of the P2 Lodge, in which Calvi figured as number 0519, dressed as Blackfriars in white tunic, with black cloak and hood, for their ritualistic meetings. An inquest jury, supported by Scotland Yard, found that Calvi had committed suicide, a verdict that caused raised eyebrows and disbelieving smiles among his relatives and the Italian press and police. For it implied that Calvi, who was 62, had displayed the dexterity of an athletic young man in seeking, as the Rome public prosecutor said, a complicated way to end himself. In the dark, and on completely strange ground, he had filled his pockets with rubble, negotiated a long ladder and wet planks which had a gap of some feet between them, seized a piece of sodden rope, tied one end to his neck and the other to a piece of scaffolding, and flung himself off. Why take so much trouble? when among his belongings were found medical syringes, 7 boxes of tablets, and 170 pills of various kinds, many of which could have done the trick more easily. But here again the obscure, somewhat bizarre, yet sinister influence of P2 and other secret societies comes into the picture. The initiation of a candidate into the craft often includes the taking of an oath not to reveal any of its secrets. Should he offend, he would undergo a violent death and then be buried near water at low level within reach of the tide, the belief being that his ghost would thereby be prevented from walking, which might embarrass his murderers. This would apply to Calvi, who in all probability had been strangled before being taken to Blackfriars, to ensure that the dangerous secrets in his possession would not be divulged. For after his mysterious and clumsy suicide, before his body was cut down, the Thames tide was covering his feet. There is nothing to suggest that Calvi had offended his brother Masons. But he was under legal pressure, and there were many who feared the possible bringing to light of his extensive financial network. The Vatican, ever since the Sindona scandal, had been on its guard against further revelations, and when the activities of P2 were brought into the open, it took a surprising and an apparently unnecessary step. The Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith reminded Catholics that according to Article 2335 of canon law they were forbidden, under pain of excommunication, to become Freemasons. This was merely a tongue-in-cheek exercise to outstep questioners since, as readers of these pages will know, some of the leading prelates at the Vatican were established Masons. But the move reflected the alarm that was felt there. 2 cardinals, Ger and Caprio, had worked hand in glove with Sindona, whose fall had brought P2 and its shady dealings into the open. A prominent member of the lodge, Umberto Ortolani, was known to have close links with the Vatican. But the most significant name that surfaced with the scandal was that of Archbishop Marcinkus, among whose several unacknowledged connections were those with mafia circles and with Licio Gelli, a former Grand Master of P2. But even more to the point, he was also president of the Vatican Bank, the most secretive and exclusive bank in the world. Marcinkus had also been a friend and business associate of Calvi, and having remarked that Calvi has our trust, he bore that out by issuing a guarantee, in the name of the Vatican Bank, to cover some of Calvi's extensive loan operations, involving many millions, as part of a vast monetary program that included international arms selling deals. But as the storm gathered, Marcinkus withdrew his guarantee, though by then sufficient evidence had come to light to justify the belief that more than normal business exchanges had passed between the Vatican Bank and the Banco Ambrosiano. The Minister for the Treasury, Andreatta, called for the Vatican to come into the open and admit its part in the crisis that was rocking the financial world. There were also demands for Marcinkus to be questioned, while pressure was put upon the Pope to dismiss him. But Marcinkus was too well versed in Vatican banking secrets for the Pope to risk his displeasure. Moreover, he had been nominated chairman of the influential Commission of Cardinals, and so was well on the way to becoming a prince of the Church, a prospect which made him unavailable for awkward contacts. For when commissioners went to the Vatican to seek information on its bank and Calvi's relationship with it, Marcinkus was not at home. And when subpoenas, implying that the recipients were subject to examination, addressed to Marcinkus and 2 of his clerical banking associates, were sent by registered post to the Vatican, the envelope was returned unopened. A somewhat grudging admission that the Vatican may have been partly responsible for the Calvi bank failure was made in August 1982 by Cardinal Casaroli. Meanwhile, the highly controversial Archbishop Marcinkus, in his office that is just a few steps down from the Pope's apartment, may sometimes handle a balance sheet from his late colleague's bank and reflect upon the words with which such